We have a somewhat idea of what gets released on Monday, somewhat an idea of what gets released the following Monday, and then perhaps what we would like to work on next.
So by the time this episode is released, maybe Podder is not an analytics platform and platform for something else.
Maybe we're building cars by that point.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Metacast, the podcast about podcasting with Ilya and me, Arnav. Ilya, so what is one of the biggest problems we have with podcasts today?
Yeah, you got me on the spot because actually it wasn't on the list of questions, but thank you, Arnav. So one of the biggest problems I personally have is analytics. First of all, because we have guests today who will talk about analytics. So that kind of, I have a recency bias. That's why it came to mind. But seriously, I was looking at our stats for our podcast and I struggled to make sense of them. That's why today we have guests who founded and run a podcast analytics company called Podder. Christian and Antoine, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
So let's start with brief intros. Christian, do you want to introduce yourself first?
My name is Christian. I am a Dane living in Spain, and I am the CEO of Podder, the analytics company you just mentioned.
So for our US listeners, Dane means Denmark?
I am Danish. Yes, I am Danish. From Denmark, that's correct.
Okay, you're putting US listeners on the spot now.
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah. So it's like if you go to Starbucks and you get a blueberry Danish, that's what it is, right?
Yes, sure. That seems to be what we're most famous for. So yeah, okay, I go with it.
And Antoine?
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Antoine. I'm French, living in Spain, and I'm the CPO, head of product of Podder.
All right. So let's maybe start with a brief introduction of your company. Tell us what Podder does.
I'd like to give a tiny little bit of background first, because I think it's a bit of an interesting story. We're four in total, so it's me and Antoine here today, and then we have two other co-founders as well. We got together about 2 years ago and started thinking, how come everybody consumes podcasts so much and talks so much about podcasting, but none of us have any idea how to run an ad on a podcast? So we decided to look a little bit into that and came to the conclusion that the world needs another advertising marketplace for host-read podcast advertising. Special focus on like maybe a multi-language thing. So a lot of things are very English focused, so we thought we want to try and cater a little bit more to maybe a European market, etc. 6 months into that, we gave up because we did not come from the industry. We were very naive. We learned a lot very quickly. We learned that, first of all, host-read podcast advertising is a super custom thing. It's very, very hard to do a self-serve platform for that. But we also learned that from a data perspective, podcasting is a very different beast to anything else we've ever dealt with. And we were very surprised by the fact that there essentially is no real data available. And what is available is, the main metric is downloads, and we don't all agree on what a download is. And often the way to get a download is to ask for someone to send a screenshot from the hosting provider with the download numbers and so on. And we just realized there's no way we can build anything sophisticated off the back of something like this. Actually, while doing the marketplace, we're trying to see what information can we gather by scraping or looking what's available publicly and build something. And at some point, we just decided, let's skip this marketplace and let's focus on this data thing instead.
And by data, you mean data that you use for analytics, right?
Yes, so what we do now is we call ourselves data analytics and audience enrichment platform for podcasts. And the reason why we focus specifically on audience enrichment is because it's such an elusive thing in podcasting. And we found some pretty cool ways of doing that. But essentially, we do a lot more around like data aggregation. We collect a lot of information on a show, and then we enrich this data in many different ways.
Cool. And so how do users interact with your app?
We're like a SaaS, like you sign up. We have like a free forever plan because we just encourage anybody to sign up. Then technically we work as an analytics prefix. So you need to insert a little prefix on your RSS feed, which is easily done through most hosting providers. And when that is done, we start generating data that you can access through a dashboard.
So speaking about analytics, what are some of the key challenges that podcasters face today? You said that, those downloads are, you get like several logs or screenshots. So today, if you look at tools like Anchor, for example, it gives you some aggregate statistics. You can look at statistics on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. In your opinion, what's missing today? What problem are you solving?
So what we all had, us four, is that we come from different things from tech or advertising, but from other industries. And one thing we were very, very surprised by is how few performance metrics are available and how they're used. So downloads is used as a metric, right? How many downloads you have. And that's a great metric because, of course, you can compare that over time, etc. And in theory, it means how many different people are listening to your content. And the more different people, well, you must assume it's because it's growing, it's getting more popular. It's a good thing. But then, we try to classify what is actually then a real download. And then does this agree that if it's more than 60 seconds, it's a real download? Because then we're kind of weeding out the bots, the indexing, the crawl list or whatever. So now if we consider everybody who listens to more than 60 seconds as a download, and that's the only metric I have. This is a wholly incomplete way to measure any kind of engagement or performance or something. You mainly consider that how much do they listen to? What parts of it did they like? Are there certain people who like certain things more than others and so on? This is more or less completely ignored now. So in terms of pure performance, it just seems like, I don't know, it seems like podcasts are being trained on downloads being the only thing they should look at. So we optimize for downloads, but we don't necessarily optimize for the content or for the completion rate or for the engagement because we don't have those metrics to look at, right?
Why is downloads that important? Why is it being made that prominent of a metric?
Because it's what we have. It's very easily accessible, right? You can count the number of requests through a feed. It's super easy. All hosting providers know this.
But does podcast platforms promote shows with more downloads? Is that how they also kind of market your shows, or no? Doesn't matter at all?
This is also interesting conversation with what powers Spotify's and Apple's charts, and for sure downloads play into that. But I am also certain that they also look at engagement. The more people that subscribe to a show, the more people that listen to the same show repeatedly, the more they listen to of that show, because those are very, very important metrics. Remember, Spotify's main goal is for you to use Spotify as much as possible. They don't necessarily care what you consume. They care that you consume it via Spotify. So of course, they're going to recommend you the highest engaging content.
Yeah, so downloads is essentially when you listen to a podcast on an app and the episode gets downloaded. I think it makes a lot of sense when you actually download the full episode and then you listen to it. Or actually, you may not even listen to it. You may just have the automatic download turned on, and then that download is sort of a fake download because the person actually didn't listen to this. So that's kind of, I think, one problem with downloads to begin with, if you have this automatic downloads. The other thing, if you actually don't download the full episode and you stream it, then how does that work? Let's say I listen to the same episode over the course of 10 days because maybe it's a super long episode from the Lex Friedman show, like 3 hours. And then I listened over the course of 10 days. So I started 10 times. Does it trigger 10 downloads?
You don't start it 10 times. You play and pause and then go away, come back after a day. And that's what you mean, right?
Right, yeah, but I mean, it makes 10 requests probably. Like every time I
Yes.
start streaming, it makes those 10 requests.
This is where it gets a little bit more technical because this even depends on platform or player to player, how exactly they do this. Some will just download the file and have it locally, and you just keep play and pausing the file that you have locally downloaded, which we cannot see. We can only see that first one. Whereas others will request a file every time you do it, which we will count as, or which we will see as individual downloads. Downloads is not a good metric for how many people actually listen to your content. Only reason why it's a good metric is because it is comparable over time. Like you can use it as a trend because, of course, you would assume that you doing that, there's a big of a chance of you doing that in the future. As download numbers are great as a like kind of a trend. How am I doing over time? It is just not a good representation for how much of your content are people consuming.
Yeah, and it's probably the only metric that's really like unified across all platforms because like download is a download.
This is then the really interesting thing, right? Because we sit as an analytics prefix, meaning that we have shows on many different hosting providers and they don't all count download the same way. We will have some of these shows write us and say, can you tell me why you say this and they say this? And sometimes we will say maybe 20% higher, but then other times another host, we will say maybe 20% lower. So it's not even like there's a complete uniform standard. There is IAB certification, there are these different things that are trying to move towards creating the standard, but despite that, there's still a big discrepancy from what host to host will show. Whether this is due to just different ideas of what it qualifies as download or not, or whether this is technically not able to count it the correct way, I do not know. But there is no uniform standard from what we can see. This is also where a little bit our not aversion, but we need to look at more than just downloads because it is not a complete thing to look at alone.
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to give a bit of history for those listeners who listen to podcasts but actually don't know how they work. So historically, back from the iTunes days, like 20 years ago, podcasts, essentially MP3 files. I mean, every episode is an MP3 file that's hosted anywhere on the web in open access, like a website. It's like a file hosted on a website. And then you have an RSS feed, which is an XML file that points to those MP3 files. And then the podcast app, I'm simplifying this, of course, but it has access to this XML file, the RSS feed. And it just knows that episode number 1 is this MP3 file, and it just downloads it from the server and plays it for you.
Well, some download it, some stream it, or some have an option.
Yeah, like Christian was explaining that, yeah, it's like all different. But I think the challenge is that there are probably tens of thousands of different ways or different servers those files can be on. And historically, the standard evolved in this kind of open way that the RSS feed was standardized by Apple, but the hosting was like anybody could do whatever they wanted. And the only real thing you could measure across those podcasts was number of network requests to that, basically server logs. That's what you could look at. And 20 years later, we are still in the same world where Now those podcast players have some stats, but they're all kind of scattered and there's still no unification. Do you know if there are any efforts between the big players to unify the standard to make it easier for everybody? Or do you think it's even in their interest to do unification? What's your opinion?
First of all, that was a good explanation. I never heard anyone explain the history of podcasting like that, and that is why it is like it is today. And yes, I know there is this IAB, and there is different people that are trying to get everybody to sign up for this and follow this. So on. There's all of these open podcasting projects, and so on. There's different players trying to do different things to uniform this. Because of course, a downside, like one thing is it's annoying that it's not done the same way, but also for advertisers that want to enter the space, if they don't get consistent numbers, they will be afraid of what it exactly is that they're buying and so on. So there's a big need of podcasting becoming a little bit more unified and professional if you want the space to keep growing, because as long as it is a little bit like hit and miss kind of thing, then it's very hard to attract new big spenders into the industry, right? So there's a big need for it and there's a big push for it. I just think it's a slow, because of this very democratized ecosystem with loads of players and loads of hosting providers and so on, it's a lot of people you need to suddenly start pulling in the same direction. And people may have different motivations for doing or not doing so. Getting people to change is always difficult, but the movement is there.
It's interesting because you mentioned advertisers, and I remember on our second episode, we talked to Brian McCullum, who is the host of the Internet History podcast and also Tech Meme Right Home. So his podcasts have millions of downloads. And he was telling us the numbers of the ads. So he sells ads on his show, and the ads are sold on a CPM basis, cost per mille, so cost per 1,000 listens. Actually, cost per 1,000 downloads. So let's say if an advertiser comes to me and I tell them I have 30,000 downloads per episode, for example. Why should they believe me? I'm curious if there is any standard or any certifications, how do you actually prove that you have those downloads? Do you know? Since you guys had some experience with advertising.
Yeah, the way you do it now is that you use a service like us or like Chartable or Podsize or Podtrack or any of these many other ones. Many of these are built specifically for advertising attribution. So the advertisers will ask the podcast in this case to insert this prefix so that they can monitor their campaign, both down to where the downloads that you have, but also some guesses at the actual attribution of these ads. So that's how you do it now. I think though, if for smaller podcasters, it's probably still, send me a screenshot of what your hosting provider says. But for larger networks and so on, I think they all just have all of these different pixels in place. So depending on what the advertiser likes to use, they can use that.
Okay, so that's an interesting point. I think, Ilya, you were asking about before they decide to advertise with you, how do they trust the data that you're telling them that I have these many downloads? But I think, Christian, what you're saying is after they agree on and they've said okay, I'm going to put my ad in, how are they going to basically attribute it and how are they going to measure what the performance of that is?
Yes, and then whether this is then paid as an estimated CPM upfront or whether it's paid on an actual CPM down the line, so I actually don't know. And I think it works differently for many different networks and advertising agencies, how they do it. Especially also because there's a more and more of a push away from host-read advertising onto dynamically inserted ads, which of course is very different because there you just pay for impressions, similar to what you would do with display advertising or something, right? Probably also the reason why people are moving onto that is because it's easier to measure, verify, and it's harder to manipulate the numbers, right?
Right. As an aside, though, just getting your opinions on the dynamically inserted ads. You folks, if you listen to podcasts, do you like that experience? Do you not like it?
I don't like it, but I understand why it exists. But of course, would prefer there was host-read advertising on podcasting mainly for many reasons. One is that studies show they convert better. I know they're more difficult to set up. They're more difficult to identify the show, set up, all of this, absolutely. But they also convert significantly better. And then because they convert better, there's higher ROI, which means the podcasters also get paid as higher CPMs for these ads. So it's also better for smaller audience podcasters as an advertising or a revenue stream.
Right. As a listener, it's a very jarring experience.
Yeah, I listened to Joe Rogan and it would be some Ford pickup truck ad, and then followed by a Burger King ad, and then followed by whatever, Heinz ketchup or something. I'm just what is this? Yeah, I'm just skipping essentially.
It gives me the same watching ads on TV kind of vibe versus when it's a host-read ad, that person is vouching for it essentially. So there's meat to it. I actually like to listen to understand what it is about and all that.
By meat, you mean skin. They have skin in the game there.
They said they have skin in it.
This is a while ago, and I can't even remember what study it was, but I remember I read this one very interesting study when we were still doing the marketplace, so a year and a half ago or something, that was talking about this with that host-read podcast advertising. Of course, you still know it's a sponsorship. You're fully aware that this company is paying the host to say this. Despite that, people identified, are you aware that you heard an ad? Yes. Will you buy this product? Yes. Because despite them fully aware it's an ad, it's still a completely different experience when it's your host delivering it to you, especially if it's a show you listen to regularly and something because you have a relationship with that voice, with that host, right? And then in addition, there was this logic that I like this brand because they are helping my host. They are sponsoring my host, which I like. So therefore I like this brand, right? So there's a completely different kind of affinity to it when it's these host-read ads, right? Which completely gets lost in dynamically inserted advertising.
So we are a podcast, so we want to use your service. Walk us through what do we need to do and how it works.
So basically the process is quite simple. Like whenever you would like to actually like create your account with Podder, you just need to create an account and you can have as many podcasts link into that account. What we are basically doing is we are creating a unique ID for each user. And then basically this ID will generate a unique prefix. And this unique prefix, you just have to add it in your hosting provider into your RSS feeds. What that will do basically, whenever there is a hit, whenever we will listen to like this URL, we will receive the hit and then we will actually know like from which episode it was and what if it was a download in which hosting provider and so on. So we will get the data from the hit because we have this redirection.
Maybe give us an example. If you have a hosting provider, where do you insert that prefix? Is there like a field for this or like how does it work?
It depends on each hosting provider. So actually on our website, podderapp.com, we have created this page where basically you just need to add your hosting provider and then we will explain how you have to do it. Obviously, there is a lot of hosting provider out there and we are covering like 15 or 20 of them in our page on our website. But we potentially could actually do it for every hosting provider that accepts a prefix within the RSS feed. There is some that doesn't accept and that don't accept it. And we are working on trying to have a partnership with them. Technically speaking, we can do it for all the hosting provider. You just need to add it. And on some of the hosting provider, there will be a field where you can just add the prefix directly in that field. And on some other, you actually need to email them.
So and when, let's say, Apple Podcasts tries to download that MP3, so it actually has the URL, it has the prefix, and then it first hits your server, and then you get the redirect to the actual server where the MP3 file is hosted. Because it has to be on the MP3 file level in order for you to get all of the hits for downloads.
The prefix sits in the enclosure tag of every episode in the RSS feed. And that's how we distinguish episode from episode. In many cases, they will have Chartable, Podsites, us, Podtrack, etc. We literally just set as redirect URLs at the front of the feed. So they can have 4 or 5 different redirects. And it just gets sent from service to service until it gets returned to the host and then returns the audio file back up to the player.
Oh, that's so funny. I didn't realize you could do like multiple.
What are some of these existing things that you talked about, Podtrack and all that, and how does Podder do different from those?
This is a super good question. We get bundled in with Chartable and Podsites and these kind of companies because we are an analytics prefix, like they are. But what we mainly focus on is audience insights, like giving a breakdown of who the audiences of a show are in terms of like what stage of life they may be at, what income brackets they belong to, etc., which is more similar to like audience measurement, right? It's not just advertising attribution, for example. One of the big differences between us and others is that, well, because we're European, everything we do is GDPR compliant because it has to, because we're European, and which has also meant that everything we do works in, well, most of the world. There are some limitations, but those are not privacy limitations. Those are limitations just based on what data is available. Whereas many other solutions that exist are very US focused specific because a lot of what they do is not allowed in other places than the US.
What's a specific example? I'm very curious about this now.
For example, the very basic one is that you cannot store or process any kind of personal information in Europe without asking for permission. And there's no way to ask a listener for permission. So you cannot store or process any information that could in any way be considered personal in Europe. In the US, you can take whatever you want. Because you can take whatever you want, and you can build profiles around it, you can base off the data you can collect, you can buy more data from others, down to the level of the address, the credit card score, if the family has kids, then the school the kids are most likely to go to, and this kind of information, which in Europe is very, very different. You cannot do anything like this, right? Which means that we had to find different ways of doing these things, whereas in the US, some things are easier. But of course, the limitation is in the US, it is then not applicable outside of the US, what you do there.
Yeah. So I'll take a quick stab at explaining GDPR and you tell me if I'm off the mark here. So GDPR is General Data Protection Regulations. That's a European law. And because of that, we see that whole thing, like accept cookies or decline cookies on the websites. That's pretty much like the TLDR of GDPR. It's like everybody has to put this cookies notice.
One more step is you own your data as a user, right? So you should be in control of your data and you should be able to go and ask whoever has your data to say, delete my data. And they have like X number of days to delete it from their side.
Or you can exchange it for a cookie or a Danish.
The logic is simply that anything that is mine or could identify me is mine. So if anyone wants to use anything of mine, they need to ask me for permission. As a general rule, I personally think that's a great idea. I agree with this push towards making things a little bit more private. But of course, it does create some difficulties and some limitations in some cases, right?
So your prefixes and those redirects, are you getting any information that might be considered PII, personal identifiable information? Do podcasts app actually have to display something like accept all cookies?
Here it gets technical, and I cannot explain 100% what we do. Well, we are collecting information that could be considered PII. Well, we're hashing it, encrypting it at the moment we receive it, and not storing the original PII.
Okay, so you're anonymizing it.
Yes.
Arnav and I, we worked on some GDPR compliance stuff. That's a nightmare to figure out and to implement.
It's a nightmare, but it's also a good reason why we can't go too much into detail, because it's also a little bit of a trade secret. Because what we then do in order to get some of the stuff that we're getting is something that we're quite proud of, that we managed to figure out how to do. We don't necessarily want to share exactly how we then do that.
Right. So I think one of the coolest features you were showing us earlier last week when we met is how you infer this raw, basically you're getting hits, right? Like HTTP request data, and how you're inferring a lot about the listener base from that.
Yeah.
Right. So what are some of those key features? You don't have to get into how you do it, but what can somebody using Podder expect out of it?
Yeah, basically like when the user logs in, and after I signed up and I got a bunch of listens through the prefixes, I log into Podder. What do I see? What are the main things that I get the value from? What are the main insights?
I think that there's two main things that are quite unique about what we do. One is simply we aggregate all the information that we can find on a given show into this dashboard that you see, and then we display everything in very performance graphs, evolutions over time, something versus something else, or in ratios and so on, so that it's easy to understand what these numbers are indicating rather than just showing you numbers. So we collect reviews, we check rankings and so on, and we just show this in different ways for you to understand whether are you improving or declining over time.
On Apple Podcasts, actually, if I go to the Apple Podcast Connect, I can only see reviews for a particular country. So if our podcast is listened across multiple countries, I have to click 225 times to see if there are any reviews in other places, which basically I don't do, obviously.
Which is bizarre that somebody came up with that, yeah.
Yeah, it's just so stupid. So do you actually aggregate reviews and ratings across all countries in iTunes?
Yes, we do.
Yeah, okay. Great.
And when you say aggregate, I think what you mean is if somebody's listening on Spotify, somebody's listening on Apple Podcasts or Google or whatever, you get the data from all these and kind of present it in an aggregated fashion.
Yes. So we don't get everything from everywhere because sometimes it is too difficult for us to find a good way of collecting that information. And in most cases, Spotify and Apple, some combination of those two will make up anywhere between 40 and 70% of a show's total listens. So we focus a lot on Spotify and Apple and getting information from there. And then if something becomes super requested or something, we may log into how can we get information from there, for example. But charts that we get now, Spotify and Apple charts, that's the only, because those are the ones everybody uses anyway, right? The same with reviews. So we try to always just focus on those two because we get the Pareto rule kind of 80-20 out of doing that.
We get most of our listens from Apple, and then I think the second one, I think, is Overcast for whatever reason, but our sample is very small, and then Spotify is third for us, and then everybody else is just super small.
Yeah, and what we see is that in Europe, typically Spotify will make up the biggest portion, then Apple number 2. In the US, typically Apple will make up the biggest portion, then Spotify number 2, and so on. So a combination of those two typically always makes up a really large proportion of the listens.
There are platforms for reviews and ratings like Podchaser and all that, right? Do you also integrate with those kind of things?
No.
So the reviews and ratings are directly from Spotify or from Apple and you're aggregating it. Good. Got it.
Yes. But one thing is that we're pulling them in, but we're not just pulling them in. We're then also displaying how many did you get in each week? How many did you get per episode? What is the cadence that you're getting them? How is the evolution of positive reviews over time and so on? So what we're trying to do is to, instead of just pulling in information, showing you the information, we're trying to make it very visibly easy to understand whether you are improving or not. This is something that we found a lot also with podcasting is that when we came in, there's a lot of these media kits. A podcaster creates a media kit, and then you focus on the things you want to show. So many podcasters, if they want advertisers, they create their own media kit, a PDF with some copy-pasted information from various platforms, right? And they will, for example, maybe put, I have 248 reviews, and put that in that media kit. But what does that mean? Relative to what? Is that a lot? Is that a little? I don't know. So everything we're trying to do is relative to something else or evolution over time. We feel like it's a better indicator of whether you're doing well or not.
Speaking of reviews, so if you're listening to this, please give us a 5-star review. Leave us a review.
Yeah.
We want to do a study on this at some point because we'd only have it anecdotally for now. But there are some shows that generate a lot more reviews than others. And typically they spend a large portion of time in the beginning of the shows to read out reviews since last time, thanking people personally, encouraging to leave reviews and so on. And this actually really works. People leave a lot more reviews. And even though reviews don't directly play into Apple chart rankings, which Apple has debunked, then psychologically it makes a difference. If you see a show with loads of reviews, you're more likely to listen to it. So I do really encourage you to try to be very active with this. But a personal approach, like saying, thank you last time, we'd like to shout out to Antoine. Thank you for leaving this review.
All right, so Antoine is leaving us a review. Good.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I think Arnab, one underused resource that we have, which we haven't actually ever used, is we should also ask our guests to leave us a review. So,
It's a super good point. And you should also remember to ask your guests to share this episode with their network in every way that they can think of. Fine.
We always learn so many things. That's part of why we started doing this podcast, is learning about podcasting. And I think we try to pick up something from every episode that we'll do in our show, right? So I think this is a great advice. We should read out reviews and all that. We're not actually getting reviews directly in those platforms, but people do send us messages, emails, and all that. We could start with that. Yeah.
we can just make up a few the first time we do it.
Honestly, if someone does that, then say, that's so nice of you. Here's a link. Do you mind writing this, on that platform? Because often people don't do it because they don't want to. They do it because it's, inconvenient. They forget it, whatever. If you just nudge a little bit.
Yeah. So actually, speaking of metrics and promoting your podcast, one of the things that we found difficult is to see how well our promotion efforts, move or don't move our metrics. There are some obvious cases. When we had the Brian McCullough on our episode too, and he mentioned our podcast on his show, we got 400 downloads the same day, which there is very clear attribution. But then for some of the others ones, we would post on Twitter, we post on LinkedIn, we post on Instagram, we have a Substack. We have no idea where people come from. We just somehow get 100 listens, and that's it. So we don't know how effective our efforts are.
So I can explain you. Basically, we are also building something, and we will have it most probably this Monday, which is called Smart Link, where any podcaster will be able to create a deep link, either on the podcast level or episode level, where he will decide which redirection he wants. So if he wants to Spotify, to Apple, and so on, he can create as many links as he wants for as many campaigns as he wants, and then he will have a dashboard with all the data about that links, the smart links. It can be aggregated data. It can be also more in-depth information about those campaigns and so on. And then you will be able to actually see that. I've been speaking to a lot of different podcasters, and that was actually something that was requested quite a lot. There is players doing it. Chartable is one of them. But this is one thing that is actually coming, and this Monday. So we're pretty close to have it.
So these are UTM tags that you see with campaigns typically, that you'd add to the URL.
Oh, these are more Bitly links, short links.
Exactly.
If I create a link like this, I think it's a smart link, right? So if you create a smart link to the Apple Podcasts directly, for example, that episode on Apple Podcasts, and I share it with somebody, I'll be able to see how many people click that link. But can I attribute this to whether they listen to the podcast or not?
This is where it's actually playing. What will happen is this link will redirect to kind of a tree map page, where you will have the different players, and then you will see also to which player they have been. You will have the unique click. You will also know to which player it has redirect and so on. And you will know for that specific link. So if you use that link on Twitter, you will know all the people that click on that link on Twitter, 80% went into Spotify. So you could also do some assumption like this.
Yeah, the idea is that down the line, this isn't the first version is not going to have this, but down the line we are also going to track and trying to monitor whether the people who click through actually come and listen repeatedly to episodes, right? So because we find there's a few different ways of measuring performance. One is how many click a link, fine. Another one is how many click a link and then click on a player, click-through rate, great. But even more, the people that clicked, are they actually ending up repeatedly listening to the show afterwards as well or not? Because that is maybe the most important of them all, right? It doesn't really matter if people click and then listen to one episode. What we want to know is that do they become loyal listeners of this show? So that's what we're trying to help with this.
Oh, and speaking of this, so I think Spotify and Apple Podcasts, they allow you to see subscribers or followers. And, in places like Instagram and Twitter, kind of success is measured by the number of followers. Do you guys also bring followers into your chart, into your platform?
We do, actually, also as a fairly new thing. We bring followers on Apple and subscribers on Spotify, I believe it is. And on top of that, we also bring in all of these other metrics. They have unique listeners, engaged listeners, but maybe most importantly, consumption rate and listen-through rate as well. That's what we meant when we say data aggregation. We also just pull a lot of the information that is available in these other platforms into this one platform.
By the way, Antoine mentioned a couple of times that this feature is coming out on Monday. By the time our listeners, you are listening to this episode, it has probably already come out because we're recording today on April 27th. He's talking about May 1st. And this episode, Ilya, is coming out on May 10th, I think, right?
Yes.
Awesome. So go check out the feature right now.
You might have even more feature by that date.
Yeah.
So you mentioned kind of how much people finish the episode, where they skip. I think Spotify and Apple, they do show some of that, but in kind of clunky way. YouTube actually does a very good job at showing the percentages of how many people finished viewing, where they skipped, etc. So are you able to aggregate that across platforms as well and show that?
Yeah, what we do now is we pull it from Spotify and Apple. So a podcaster owns Spotify and Apple data as well. We can pull it to the platform. And then we do like a weighting of this. So we, depending on how much each of these platforms represent of your total listeners, we will apply some kind of weighting and we'll do an average. And then we will say, here's what we think across your audience as a whole is what's happening based off of those two platforms. But as mentioned, in most cases, they will make up 40 to 60% of the total listens.
It will be really interesting to see that aggregation for our podcast, I think. Because our listenership is so small, individual, like looking at YouTube or Apple or Spotify, it doesn't make that much sense. But combined, actually, there might be a bigger sample. It might make more sense. Because sometimes I would listen to an episode that we, about to publish, and I'm like, maybe this part seems a little bit boring. But there is no way for me today to actually measure whether people skipped over that part or whether maybe that part forces them to just like, oh, this stuff is boring, I'll just drop, right? So having that kind of mapping of the drop-off to content, I think, like you said, it's like performance of the past content. It helps you improve your future content. Yeah, we would love to have that.
This is actually one of the things that we're now doing. Apple and Spotify do give very interesting information. They, however, do not give you a lot of control over how you want to see this or how you want to filter or sort through this. Because we collect it on a daily basis, we allow you to filter through everything on a much more granular level. Exactly to try and see this, right? One thing is episodes, 2 episodes, but also episode versus the same episode at another period of time. Is there any difference, right? There's a lot of very interesting things to be concluded by being able to see this, right?
Yeah, kind of going a bit of a different topic. I saw with my Russian podcast when I was still doing that. So there is a local player in Russia called Yandex, which is basically like a search engine. It's a Google, it's Uber, and it's Spotify, and it's also a kind of podcasting thing. It's like a huge corporation that owns pretty much like all technology in Russia, except for a bank, I think. So what they do, actually, they download all of the MP3 files to their own servers, and you only get one download from them. That's like all you get. And then they stream it from their own servers when people listen. And to access their stats, they also the local AWS. So you have to go to the Yandex Cloud, subscribe for some kind of analytics thing. They provide you a dashboard. And that's the only place where you can actually see those. They are like very much like a closed garden. Obviously, it's a very country specific. But I'm wondering in the future if, let's say, Apple or Spotify or some like other new player decides to do the same thing, and then you start having those walled gardens. I think that makes life for podcasters. On one hand, it gives them more data. On the other hand, all of the data is scattered all over the place. It's almost like not worth aggregating. And that's where your service could really come in and aggregate all that.
This is an actual concern, right? Because it does look like maybe Spotify is trying to do something like this, right? To own something in every single link of the chain in the podcasting industry and then slowly close you into that ecosystem. Which will, of course, be interesting because I don't know how much it is worldwide, but I would assume that Spotify makes up a huge chunk of total podcast listens. And they suddenly just remove those off the RSS feed-based part of podcasting. It will have a huge impact, right? So
yeah, it becomes something like YouTube, right? Like YouTube, you could watch the videos all you want, but you can't watch YouTube videos elsewhere.
Yeah.
I mean, you can embed on your webpage, but you can't like build an app that uses YouTube videos, or you can't like download them and like do some processing on them, etc. Podcasting is very democratized, like you said.
Yeah.
I mean, running something like YouTube is very expensive, so maybe it makes more sense. So I'm curious from your users who use Podder, what is the most loved feature?
Like as a gimmicky thing, then we have this audience persona kind of thing, which is something that's where most people are like, wow, when they see that, mainly because we kind of visualize what your most typical listener will look like. We have a little bit of help from the AI image generator DALL-E to actually draw this persona and so on. So that I think is something that creates the most wow factor when we show that. However, in terms of the outright utility, then this audience insights that we do, for sure. Because all of the performance stuff that we do, well, you can get that on other platforms. The only thing we do different is, as I mentioned, the performance kind of way of showing it in graphs. But it's data that you can also find in Refonic and Chartable and also other places. The consumption rate stuff we do, we break it down in slightly smarter ways, but you could still just log into Apple and Spotify and see it there, right? The audience insights you cannot really get anywhere else. So this is something that has really been especially to solutions based outside of the US, they are particularly particularly interested in it, right? They're not able to get it in any other way. So that is by far the most interesting, because the ecosystem needs more advertising money. There's no way around that. It may not be romantic, but if podcasting needs to stay and grow, we need more advertising money in the ecosystem. And in order to get that, we need to make podcasting more attractive to advertisers who are used to getting a lot of information on who they are targeting and reaching and so on. And this is a little bit what we can help with, right? So that's definitely what people are mentioning.
When you say insights, what are some of those examples? What do I get as a podcast creator? When I log in, what do I see?
So mainly we break the audience down and say they belong to this income bracket, or they are likely to have children in the household. They're likely to have cars in the household. They're likely to be at this stage of life. They're likely to have this education level. They're likely to own their home. They're likely to work in a large corporation. Like, we break down a whole bunch of different things like that. That, in many cases are common sense, but in other cases they're not for a podcast of who the audience particularly are. And then what is very interesting is, because we tag this to each episode, well, we allow you to see whether certain episodes attract different audiences to other episodes, or sometimes maybe a certain type of episode will attract a certain type of audience in the US, but a different type of audience in the UK and so on. And we make this very visual. The idea behind knowing these demographics is that you can also assume some things. It's good for an advertiser may say, I want to target people who own a home that live in rural US. Well, we can show you that, whether they do or not. We can show how many of your listeners probably are like this. But in addition to that, we also give purchase intent scores. So we list a whole range of different things that says the likelihood of the audience being interested in this service or product, or having this interest. So again, trying to make it also useful instead of just providing data.
That's very cool. How much can you share about how that works? Like, how do you get this data?
We aggregate from many different sources. I cannot necessarily tell exactly where, but it's aggregated on many different sources. And in many cases, this is based off of national census data, national neighborhood statistics data. So if a person lives there, they are likely to have these demographics, this demographic makeup. This means that what we're doing is more similar to old school audience measurement than it is to modern cookie-based tracking. Downside to that is that we require a little bit of volume. At low numbers, there may be like statistical anomalies. That means that it could be random, which gets weeded out over time. So the more downloads, the more accurate this gets.
And at the same time, you're anonymizing that data. So even though you're able to predict and show this data is not identifiable to a specific person or a household.
That's the whole key behind everything that we're doing, that we managed to find a way of avoiding in any way storing anything that could be linked back to an individual, and yet deriving all of these things off of it.
So we actually had an episode where we spoke for about 10 or 15 minutes on a random off-topic about cars. So we should actually look at if people who listen to us have cars, maybe they're not interested at all, Okay, so how much does Podder cost?
Well, there's a free forever plan, which is anybody can sign up, put the prefix in, start generating data, and they'll get access to most of the features that we have. The main limitation of the free plan is that we cap the history. You cannot look more than 2 weeks back in time. So if you want to use it as a tool that you regularly log into just to see how you're performing, we can get everything for free. If you want to really identify like trends over time and see how you evolve and this kind of stuff, you need to pay us $20 a month for shows up to a certain size. If you are a network or have more shows or have like custom needs, it's custom pricing, because we can also deliver everything in an API, or you can get raw data dump where we can build custom things for you. But of course, this all depends on the kind of needs that you have in this case. But for any like indie podcasts or hobby podcasts, or you want to classify it, it's either free or $20 a month.
Got it. So, and if you have a network, let's say you have 50 podcasts, how is Podder beneficial for those companies?
That's actually really interesting. One of the things we learned as we started speaking to more and more of these networks, well, one of the things we're surprised by is how many things are done in fairly old school ways. So what we have started building out is a lot more like time-saving tools. So we built some very sophisticated reporting where you can build very nice looking custom reports across whatever you want, different shows, different episodes, different date ranges, and then share them with whoever you want to share them with, because we know there's a lot of reporting going on, and we know it takes a lot of time because often it's manually created PDFs with screenshots and so on. And then something else is we're building these network overviews, where we're just letting a network see all of their shows in one view, all the shows, all the data points, and they can filter through and sort through them there. So kind of like a dashboard where you monitor the performance of everything in one go. And then in addition, of course, networks tend to make their revenue off ad sales. And our main thing is still these audience demographics, which are very beneficial when trying to convince advertisers why your show is a good show for their product.
Okay, so is it fair to say that most people who get real return on investment from a service like Podder, or from Podder specifically, is people who actually want to run some ads, because it gives them a lot of tools to sell the ads, to report on ads, to measure ads?
Measure ads we do not do. We only do like these reports based on historical data. We do not do any attribution or anything like this. The reason why I keep coming back to that is because it's such a clear value add. Because most people who do ad sales have been in a situation where an advertiser have said, okay, but who are they? Well, according to Spotify, they are majorly female. Okay, but what is the purchasing power? I have no idea. Well, we can tell this. So there's a very, very clear value add there. However, what we're trying to also become more is performance monitoring. And this is a little bit just based off, we think there's not a lot of data-driven decision-making in podcasting, and we want to make that a little bit more. So, because if you really do look at all the metrics we do, it's very easy to monitor what worked, what did not work, when you're doing well, and so on. So we're actually starting to do a lot of very specific use cases on helping shows grow their audiences by using specific things that we do to show that this is also a really good use case for using Podder.
Oh, can you tell us more about how you help? So can you help us grow our audience? Please.
Some of the main things is just, as I mentioned, we monitor all of these things already about a show, the reviews, the rankings, the downloads, and the consumption rate. So we make it very visible which episodes are working well, which ones are not, and so on. What we are then trying to do in addition is we're trying to now run these studies showing why do some shows generate significantly more reviews per download than others, and then try to draw some conclusions from that we can recommend to others. We're also just trying to look at your release schedules, what days are you releasing on, what times you're releasing on, how long is your episode, and then try to recommend based on best practices from other shows that may go faster. But one of the main things is these smart links. We want people to use our smart links to promote their shows because it will help us monitor and include in all the other graphs how many of your downloads and so on come from these links. But also just maybe you do 10 different things every time you release an episode, and maybe 2 of those are driving all the traffic. Well, let's stop doing the others and do more of those, right? We want to, just from that perspective, we're just playing around with it for now, but we're trying to also do a tool that when we start doing these smart links, we will also digest what an episode is about, try to look on Twitter if for people discussing this particular subject, and then send you an email saying, we recommend you create a smart link and engage in this conversation and share your episode here because they seem to be talking about what your episode is about. So try to actively help do some of the research that podcasters now do not, in many cases, have the time to do.
And not just Twitter, but
first Twitter, because it's very easy, but then make Quora or Reddit or LinkedIn or whatever it may be down the line.
Yeah, on LinkedIn, you need to write something self-congratulatory about your podcast.
And then you need to end with thoughts.
But it can really take off. And LinkedIn posts sometimes, for some reason, they explode, right? So if it's the right post, the right context, it may be great, right?
Yeah, some of those posts are actually pretty kind of cheesy. I read them and I cringe at those posts, but for some reason people like them. I can't write those myself. It's just not my style. Maybe I should write ChatGPT, write me a LinkedIn-style cringy post that will get popular, and then post it under a pseudonym because I don't want to put my name in it.
But it's it gets engagement, right? Some people are really good at creating these and they get a lot of engagement.
Yeah, I know. I'm just jealous.
So, Ilya, if you really enjoy those kind of posts, there's a subreddit called LinkedIn Lunatics. You should look at that. It's fun.
Yeah, it's a bit of topic that I just want to quickly share about LinkedIn. We post everything on LinkedIn, and sometimes we get pretty decent engagement. I would say maybe in the thousands of views. But I think what I noticed, we did post a video twice with people, just a short clip, a person talking about something that's very interesting. But for some reason, the number of impressions on those posts are very low, which means that people are not engaging with it. It means that actually LinkedIn doesn't show them to people. So that's just something that I discovered yesterday. It's just how bad videos perform, or at least my videos. Whereas just a post with the link and a picture tends to perform a lot better. I don't know, we'll have to dig more into this.
They're also pushing the lives, right? I think LinkedIn is really doing a lot to push people to do these LinkedIn lives. At least I now get notifications all the time from all sorts of different sources that someone is doing a live. When I'm on the app on my phone, it'll just come up with a notification that fills up half the screen saying someone that I don't even necessarily know who is doing a live right now.
Oh, it's like a Clubhouse kind of thing?
Yeah.
Like Twitter Spaces, yeah.
Like Twitter Spaces, yeah. But where Twitter Spaces is nicely confined to a little bar at the top of the screen when you're on the app, then LinkedIn, it comes up someone is doing a live. I don't care, yeah.
Well, I have LinkedIn notifications off, so.
Yeah, the same thing. Because every time you go to LinkedIn, there are 20 notifications. Just feeds you all sorts of random stuff from people you don't know. It was actually, again, going to go a bit on a tangent. I was meeting somebody from work a couple of weeks ago, and we were in a kitchen in the office, and he got a LinkedIn notification on his watch. So he pulls it on, and he's like, people are reacting to Ilya Bezdilev's post. Do you remember Winamp? And then basically, he reads from his watch, he reads my post. And there are also other people around. It was just so uncanny and cringy, I guess.
So what's the long-term vision for Podder? What's next? What's the 5 years down the line? What are you thinking of?
Honestly, a super good question. We have tried several times making 5-year plans or even 3-year plans, and it's really, really hard because you spend a long time doing that, and then a week later, you can throw it all out. So as mentioned, we started out with this advertising thing, right? And now we're not doing that at all. This goes against all of the common sense you learn and so on. But what we kind of like learned is that we do kind of go with the flow, whatever that means. I guess because we're still a fairly small team, we can adapt very quickly and so on. So since we started with this analytics thing, we listen to what people say. We try to go on calls with all of our users. We try to go on calls with all sorts of different players in the industry and ask, what's annoying? What's taking your time? What are you missing? What would make you use this tool more? Or how can we save some time here? And then we adapt based on that. That also means we don't necessarily have a roadmap. The product roadmap goes maybe a month out into the future. That's more or less it. We have a somewhat idea of what gets released on Monday, somewhat an idea of what gets released the following Monday, and then perhaps what we would like to work on next. For now, that's working quite well.
So by the time this episode is released, maybe Podder is not an analytics platform and platform for something else.
Maybe we're building cars by that point.
Cars, yeah.
So talking about a small team, you said 4 people. How did you all meet? How do you know each other?
We're 6 on the team in total, but we're 4 co-founders. And well, all of my co-founders are people I have worked with at different times. And they have, in some cases, also worked with each other, but not all 3 knew each other beforehand. As I started playing around with this idea and so on, I slowly realized I needed people that were better at me at specific things. So I slowly reached out one by one to these different ones and said, oh, I'm, by the way, working on this thing. Would you be interested in something? And luckily, they all said yes. So yeah, we all worked together before, and that's kind of like how I knew them. I knew what they were super good at. I knew what I was not good at, and I knew that, for example, with Antoine, I need what he can do, and I like working with him, and I assume that he liked working with me as well. And then afterwards with another guy, saying, okay, we need what this guy can do, and he's really cool to work with, so slowly onboard him, and then the same with another guy. So that's kind of how it came to be.
Okay, so Christian, you are the CEO. Antoine, you're the product officer, CPO. Who are the other 2 people? What do they do? And then beyond that, you have 4 founders, you said, and total 6 people. So what do the other 2 people do?
So there's Josh, who's CTO, and then Dimitar, who is CMO. And then in addition, we have Franco and Veronica, who do different operations tasks, mainly helping us actually run the business. Something we sometimes get caught up in is building cool things, trying to do cool things, trying to run a little bit too fast, and sometimes forget the actual business part of the business, which is remembering all the boring stuff and so on. So that's mainly the kind of help we have contracted.
Boring stuff, you mean like money and taxes?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Papers, contracts, yeah, that kind of stuff.
Lawyers.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit more about when did it start? It sounds like you started it, Christian, and then like you got everybody excited about it, joined together. You're now part of an accelerator in Spain. How did all of that come about?
I guess I started playing around with it at the very end of 2020. And then I don't remember the exact date, but Antoine was the first that joined me on the project somewhere in the beginning of 21, I believe, maybe. In May 21, we officially launched the company because we realized, we're going to do this. There's something here. We were part of an incubation program, something called Demium in Barcelona at that point, and went through them. We were doing that marketplace at that point, and I think it took another 6 months or something before we realized that's not what we were doing. Both Dimitar and Josh, I guess, joined around the time when we kind of really decided that we were doing this analytics thing. I can't remember exactly when we decided it, but I remember June last year was when we said, okay, now we have enough so we can launch this to the world. This also coincided with, there's this accelerator program here in Valencia in Spain called Lanzadera, which is a very prestigious one here in Spain. And they said, this looks cool, what you're doing, come here and join us. And actually me and Antoine moved together to Valencia for 5 months to then join this acceleration program, which was really, really cool doing the experience like that, because otherwise we're a fully remote team, right? He's calling in from Bilbao, I'm calling in from Valencia, we have somebody in Barcelona and so on. So that was really cool because that also gave a really good boost when we just relaunched as new, But what we launched in June and what we have now, less than a year later, is like, I don't know, a lot has happened in the last year.
What were your backgrounds before starting the company? Like, what were you doing before that?
I have an education in marketing, general marketing, but I worked in a lot of different things, like a jack of all trades kind of thing, like human relations, marketing, advertising, this kind of stuff.
In a big company or like small company?
Medium-sized company, SMEs, yeah.
And I was working for a consulting company, basically like helping product owner building products. I just love building products. That's literally what I have. Before joining at Podder, I was also like focusing a lot into data integration and site tracking integration. And this is also where I was like, okay, there is something here we can do.
Something that is with all 4 of us is none of us have formal training in anything that we're doing. And I'm not the tech one. I'm the dumb one of the group. I'm the one who talks a lot. That's my job. Everybody else, nobody has formal training in what they're doing. All self-taught, all just hacky, let's try and see what we can make work and so on. I find this to be maybe one of our biggest strengths because there's no limitations. We will find a way to do things, right? Yeah, like I think people are very often get very surprised at how small this team is compared to what we show them, because it doesn't necessarily follow the picture that they thought we should be compared to what we're showing them, you know?
And who's coding? Who's doing the hands-on stuff?
Antoine and Josh.
Who's actually doing the work?
Well, the work, except for the money part of the work. Sure. Yeah.
If there was no code, there would be no money part.
Very true.
That's the thing, right? It's interesting, like you said, said it in a very self-deprecating way that you're the dumb one. But I think what I've learned over the years of working with engineers in big companies, they're very talented and they create really cool stuff. But some of them are not as good as like promoting themselves to the outside world. So they basically like stay in their small space and just like, why isn't everybody recognizing me, right, for what I'm doing? And then they need somebody who's like a dumb one, like you said, right, who can actually like go and sell the team, even within the big company, right? And name specific people and elevate them and sell a product. So yeah, because like without people writing the code, there would be no money, no product. But also without somebody who can talk and sell, those people would be doing this for nothing. So this is a very important symbiosis, I guess. Many startups are started by a smart one and a dumb one, like an engineer and a product manager.
But this is actually, I think the key word for us here is that in terms of being a team, we are pretty complete in the sense that we cover a little more or less everything that needs to be covered. I just always find it a little bit funny because I am the CEO, which sounds so grand, but in theory, I am the one lucky that I have smart people doing the stuff, and then I'm the one doing the customer service emails and the admin and the whatever. That's the reality.
That's the reality of a CEO of a startup. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a friend who had a company 10 years ago, which they actually sold to Yandex back then. But I remember he was saying, like, I don't know what my title is. Like, I'm a co-founder. He wasn't the CEO. He was just a co-founder. And he's like, it means, like, I bring pizza to the office. I hire people, like, whatever, like, mop the floor if that's what the team needs right now. And then he does all like talking and partnership. So basically, like, he did, like, everything that is nobody's job,
Yeah.
Like, in a big company, it's nobody's job. But in a small company, that's what co-founders and the CEO kind of fill in. Is just whatever you need to do to not distract people who are doing the work from doing the work.
Or even more, whatever you need to do to make sure they have whatever they need, right? Like remove the noise and so on to the extent possible so they can focus on doing what they're doing.
So talking about money, at what point did you all feel like, okay, this is solid, we want to work on this, and like, here's our runway? Or did you immediately go for like seed, incubator, investment kind of things? How did you work out that initial part?
We raised a tiny little pre-seed round when we did the advertising marketplace, spent that on nothing because we then gave up on it, and have since then not raised more money, and have also for now kind of decided that this is probably not the route we want to go. Maybe at some point it is, but at the moment, not really. We're doing all right, but of course, it's still a struggle. We're still an early stage small startup. What we do like, though, is to keep our independence as much as possible, because a lot of what drives the motivation here is that we have quite a lot of fun doing what we're doing because we can do what we want to do. Even though it was a small round, we did learn a little bit from raising some money. And then, when you have money, you spend that money. We don't want to do that again until we're at the stage where we're done playing around, like done trying to do different things and so on.
It makes a lot of sense. Actually, these guys, Squadcast, the tool that we're using now for recording, they also bootstrapped their company without actually any investment, which was very, very interesting. I mean, they were still keeping their full-time jobs while working on this. And then at some point, they started to make enough money, they quit. And yeah, they're now, I think, a team of 10 or so, 11. I guess you probably grow slower than you could have if you had like 10 million from VCs and you could hire like 50 people. But then at the same time, like you were saying, if you're still playing around, you probably need more freedom and more space than to have like a board meeting every month.
And it's true, we could grow faster, like we could build faster, we could get clients faster and so on. But podcasting is still a fairly small ecosystem. We kind of know the whole ecosystem. Like we know most of the people in most of the companies because we met them, go to these events, tap with them and so on. So there's not so much point in posting a lot of money into marketing because who would we market and what would we tell them that they don't already know? Then of course you could argue maybe more salespeople and so on, but it's still like a minor thing. Like we're on friendly terms with most. In terms of developing, yes, it's true, but there's also something super refreshing or cool about being lean and adaptable. Right? As soon as you start adding more resources in and more structure in it, the output per person goes down. Now, or at least that's the perception we have, that the output perception now is super high for what we are. And if you start making more rigid structures and more defined roles and so on, we think all of that might slow down a little bit. We are spitting out new features on a weekly basis, and people are spending very fast compared to what some larger companies do, right? So as long as we can do that, then why would we change it,
Yeah, in large company, it would take like 3 months just to negotiate a feature, to make all the compromises, and then like write a design doc, and then like schedule it for the next quarter. And then like a year later, it comes out, and it's like nothing like what you envisioned. It's like half of what you envisioned, and it doesn't even perform well.
Wait, you forgot the review of the design docs, which takes 3 months.
Me and Antoine hop on a call, and then 2 weeks later, we have something new.
Yes, this is exactly what we love about it. Because we don't have a lot of trends, then what we are saying is like, okay, we have this idea. We need to actually know if that could be a product market fit because there is actually people asking for it, but we need to validate it. And then we are thinking, how can we build an MVP fast within a week, send it to the people that need it, get feedback. And if we actually see that this is something that they would love and that they will use, then we are actually like putting into our backlog of requirements. That's basically the approach we have, and this is what we love doing. We love knowing what's the issue, working on it, find an easy solution. Is it working? Yes, let's make it better from the feedback, not from the idea that we have.
Christian, I think last time we spoke, off the record, you said you went to podcast movement. How was that?
Yeah, it was cool. Very cool. Mainly because podcasting is a very US-centered ecosystem. And so being in Europe, sometimes you're a little bit on the outside of it. And so it was really cool to meet everybody in person. I've been on so many of these Zoom calls, but never actually met people. So for that sense, it was really, really cool.
Yeah, it's like a conference. Was it in Las Vegas or where was it?
It was in Las Vegas, yeah. Las Vegas I could do without. All that noise and so on, no. I don't need that. The conference was cool, but the setting did nothing for me.
Yeah, and the cigarette smoke. Every time you walk there, it's like you breathe cigarette smoke.
Exactly. You can smoke inside everywhere. And then Elvis everywhere, and I don't know what. It was too much of everything.
Yeah, and like $25,000 wine that like would cost you $15, like in the 7-Eleven next door. But when you were there, by the way, how long is it? Like how many days?
Was it 4 days, I think?
What do you actually do there? I mean, I assume there are some talks, but like outside of the talks, what do you do there?
Because this was like the first time to meet people in person, I had just set up a load of in-person like coffees and so on with both people that I already knew and also people that we have been talking to about maybe doing something together and saying. So for the last 3-4 months before going, I would always ask someone in an email, by the way, are you going to Podcast Movement? Because then we can meet there. So I literally just had a whole range of meetings set up for every single day.
Who are these kind of people? Are these podcast creators, podcast industry people, or people who are building platforms for podcasts? Who are these people that are showing up there?
Yeah, so there are two different of these podcast movements, apparently. There's the one I went to is Evolutions, which is slightly smaller, but slightly more industry. And then there is the normal podcast movement, which is in Denver in August, which is more the creators themselves that come to. But I had meetings with literally everything. Something that we've always had is we just like to speak to people in the ecosystem, regardless of who they are, because that's how we kind of learn things, And also because there's opportunities everywhere. It doesn't have to necessarily be someone where, I know I can sell you something, otherwise I don't want to talk to you. No, the opposite. We talk to anybody because we can learn from all of them and maybe you can introduce to other people or whatever it is. So it was literally like a random mix of everything, but it was amazing. Like it was really, really cool. People trying to solve also monetization in all different ways. And like, it's really, really, really just fun. We always go to a lot of tech conferences here in Europe, and it's always just fascinating talking to founders, startups, etc., and trying to like, what are they doing, how are they doing, and how do they come up with that? What's the reasoning, the logic, all of this kind of stuff. This was the same, but podcast focused.
So we are happy to be one of those random people who you guys talk to, especially on the record. So let's finish with that. So where can people find you?
Well, potterapp.com, by far the best place, especially if you have a show. Go there, sign up, it's free. If you want to talk to me or Antoine, there's a little chat box that pops up where you can write a message and we will get it. This is the CEO job at an early stage startup. Otherwise, I think LinkedIn is by far the best. In my case, I think I would have to type it out because I have a very complex Danish name that is quite hard for me to portray in a way that I think people would pick up on and be able to find me.
We'll just put it in the show notes.
So we'll put in the show notes, and if you subscribe to our Substack, you will be able to see the show notes and links to the Christian's LinkedIn. But don't forget to give us a 5-star rating before that. So Antoine, how about you?
Right, the same. Like on LinkedIn would be the best, but I assume I will need to write it down also. Have a complicated French name.
Do people use Facebook in Europe? Is it still popular?
It's an older generation thing, more or less, I think.
Okay. I was just curious because somebody recently asked me I'll send you my Facebook page, and I'm like, well, I have a Facebook account, I just haven't logged in ages.
I know, but I have the same. Whenever I need to log in, I'm like, what's my password? I can't remember when I last did this.
Yeah, but if one really reputable password management company paid us for sponsoring them, we would name them on our show.
But we have one that we love, yes.
Yeah, one. Yeah. It's a password management.
One.
Subtle.
Very subtle. Yeah. Christian, earlier you said you don't listen to much podcasts, but do you want to talk about a book? What do you recommend? What are you interested in right now?
Oh my God, what a question. Right now, working a lot, so there's not so much time left for podcasting and so on. But otherwise, some of the stuff that has been very inspiring to listen to running a startup is Masters of Scale, for example, or even like Tim Ferriss, especially some of the older ones with Tim Ferriss, where he talks to, can't remember the name now, but for example, Automatics founder and so on.
To Matt Mullenweg.
That's the one, Matt Mullenweg, yeah. Some of those have been very, very inspirational and cool to listen to. Oh, I actually have one very specific recommendation to startup founders, which I think might be super interesting, which is the Mom Test, I think it's called. It's, I believe, an English guy who wrote this short book called The Mom Test, about how to MVP stuff or how to validate ideas and so on without actually biasing. This is single most important and best feedback and learning I've had in doing startups and how to validate stuff in a proper way quickly.
You mentioned the Masters of Scale, which is a podcast by LinkedIn's founder, Reid Hoffman. Actually, I wonder if he envisioned that his network would have like a subreddit, LinkedIn Lunatics.
Right.
But yeah, it's a great podcast. I like listening to it.
And what about Antoine?
My only recommendation is anything in terms of no code, low code for anyone that wants to start a startup. Not like trying to spend too much time on development, as you mentioned, but like try to look into easy solution like no code, low code. They have like a huge community that will help you like build your idea in a fast way and try to validate it instead of spending too much money. And I really love that community. I know there is some podcast about no code, low codes, creating SaaS. I think one of them is Indie Hacker. That is quite good, but that would be my main recommendation.
Do you folks use any no-code or low-code platforms?
To validate stuff, to MVP stuff, we do.
What do you use?
Automatization, we can use Make, for instance. That used to be Integromat. I don't know, like it depends what the idea we want to build and so on. But as Christian mentioned, it's just in terms of, okay, we have this MVP in mind, how can we build it within some days and try to validate it? And if that's a good idea, then we are discussing together with the CTO, Josh, in order to implement it.
That's very cool. All right. So, well, thank you for coming to the show, guys.
Thank you. Pleasure speaking to you.
It was a pleasure.
And thanks for listening.